Every morning, before the weight of empire settled on his shoulders, Marcus Aurelius wrote, not orders, not strategy, not the business of ruling 60 million people across 3 continents. He wrote reminders to himself. And the most repeated reminder in all of his private journals was this: you are going to die. Not someday, not eventually, soon. And before that day arrives, every decision you make either builds a life you can be proud of or adds to a pile of regret you will never have enough time to undo. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding that thought. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire life using it. He called it memento mori. Remember that you will die. And what he discovered, what the Stoics had understood for centuries before him, is that the awareness of death is not a burden. It is the clearest lens a human being can use to see what actually matters. Strip away the noise, the distractions, the things you think you want but don't, and what remains is a life lived with intention, a life without regret. That is what this video is about. Not death, not fear, but the ancient Stoic practice that turns the awareness of your own mortality into the sharpest decision-making tool you will ever have. The same tool that helped a Roman emperor govern the most powerful civilization in human history without losing himself in the process. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Marcus Aurelius used memento mori and how you can use it today in your own decisions, your own priorities, your own life. Chapter 1. What is memento mori? The practice that changed history. The phrase itself is Latin, memento mori. Remember that you will die. But the practice is older than the Latin language, older than Rome, older than the Stoic philosophers who turned it into one of the most powerful mental tools in human history. The ancient Egyptians placed skulls on the tables of their banquets, not to disturb their guests, but to remind them that the feast was temporary. The samurai of feudal Japan began each morning by meditating on their own death, not out of despair, but because a warrior who has already accepted death fights with a clarity that no amount of training alone can produce. The Romans took the practice further. When a general returned from battle to a triumph parade through the streets of Rome, the greatest honor the city could bestow, a slave would ride beside him in the chariot, whispering the same words into his ear throughout the entire celebration. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. Even at the height of glory, the reminder was there. The Stoics inherited this tradition and refined it into something more precise. For Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, memento mori was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a daily practice with a specific purpose: to cut through the noise of ambition, fear, vanity, and distraction, and force the mind to confront the only question that actually matters. Given that your time is finite and non-negotiable, what are you going to do with the hours you have left? Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in the 1st century, put it with the directness that made him one of the most quoted Stoics in history. In his letters on ethics, he wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and that the man who has learned to think about death clearly has also learned to think about life clearly. The two are inseparable. You cannot know how to live until you have honestly confronted the fact that you will not live forever. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea repeatedly throughout the Meditations. He reminded himself that Alexander the Great and his mule driver ended up in the same place, that emperors and slaves, philosophers and soldiers, the celebrated and the forgotten, all of them returned to the same dust. This was not pessimism, it was precision. By leveling every human life down to its common endpoint, Marcus was able to see past the artificial urgency of daily life and focus on what genuinely deserved his attention. That clarity is what memento mori produces. And it is exactly what most people, living in a culture that treats death as a subject to be avoided at all costs, have never been given access to. Chapter 2. How Marcus Aurelius used death to make better decisions. Marcus Aurelius became emperor at the age of 40. He had spent 23 years preparing for the role, studying philosophy, practicing self-discipline, training his mind with the same rigor that Roman soldiers trained their bodies. And when the weight of the empire finally landed on him, he brought with him a practice that would define every major decision he made for the next 19 years. The daily confrontation with his own mortality. This was not a passive exercise. Marcus did not simply remind himself of death and move on. He used that reminder as an active filter, a way of testing every decision, every priority, every allocation of his time and attention against the only standard it cannot be argued with. When you know that your time is finite, the question of how to spend it becomes suddenly, almost painfully, clear. The Meditations give us a direct window into how this worked in practice. In Book 4, Marcus wrote that you could leave life right now, and that this thought should determine everything you do, say, and think, not as a dramatic gesture, not as a rehearsal for despair, but as a practical tool for cutting through the noise that fills most human decision-making. When you ask yourself whether a decision aligns with the life you want to have lived, the answer comes faster and with far less confusion than when you ask whether it feels comfortable or convenient. Marcus applied this filter to the most consequential decisions of his reign. When the Antonine Plague swept through the empire in 165 CE, killing an estimated 5 million people over 15 years, Marcus did not retreat. He stayed at the front, managing the response, leading campaigns on the Danube frontier while the empire suffered around him. Historians who have studied his correspondence from that period note the absence of panic, the absence of the frantic decision-making that characterizes leaders who have not made peace with the possibility of their own death. Marcus had already done that work. Every morning at his writing table, by the light of a single oil lamp, he had already faced the worst. When the worst arrived in the form of plague and war, he was ready. This is the practical power of memento mori that most people miss when they first encounter the concept. They hear, "Remember that you will die," and they think it is about acceptance, about making peace with the inevitable. It is about that, but it is also about something more immediate and more useful. It is about decision quality. It is about the difference between a life built on what actually matters and a life built on what seemed urgent in the moment but turned out to be noise. Marcus understood that the enemy of good decisions is not stupidity. It is distraction. It is the endless stream of things that feel important but are not, the opinions of people who will be forgotten, the status gains that produce nothing of lasting value, the fears that never materialize, and the desires that, once satisfied, reveal themselves to be empty. Memento mori cuts through all of it, because when you hold the awareness of death clearly in your mind, the distraction loses its grip. What remains is signal. Chapter 3. The regret most people carry and why it happens. There is a nurse named Bronnie, who spent years working in palliative care, caring for people in the last weeks of their lives. She kept notes on the conversations she had with her patients during those final weeks, and eventually compiled them into a book. The patterns she found were striking in their consistency. The dying did not regret the risks they had taken. They did not regret the failures, the embarrassments, the times they had tried and fallen short. What they regretted, with a weight that Ware described as almost unbearable to witness, were the things they had never done, the life they had never lived, the decisions they had postponed until postponing was no longer an option. The most common regret, she recorded, was this: "I wish I had lived a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not a regret about a single decision. It is a regret about a pattern of choices made over decades, each one individually small and seemingly reasonable, that accumulated into a life that never quite became what the person actually wanted. A career chosen for stability instead of meaning. A relationship maintained out of habit instead of genuine connection. A dream deferred so many times that the person eventually stopped believing it had ever been real. Marcus Aurelius understood how this pattern forms. In the Meditations, he wrote about the way human beings allow themselves to be pulled by external forces, by the opinions of others, by social expectations, by the momentum of choices already made, until they look up one day and realize they are living someone else's life. He called this the loss of the inner citadel, the surrender of the one thing that no external force can take by force, but that a person can give away slowly, one small compromise at a time. The mechanism behind regret is not mystery. It is the gap between the life a person values and the life a person actually builds. And that gap forms not through dramatic failures, but through the accumulation of decisions made without clarity. Decisions made in the fog of distraction, of social pressure, of short-term comfort. Decisions made by people who, at the moment of choosing, had forgotten that their time was finite. This is precisely what Memento Mori was designed to prevent. Not by making every decision feel heavy or dramatic, but by providing a reference point that cuts through the fog, a standard against which any decision can be tested before it becomes a regret. Marcus did not stumble into a life of purpose and discipline by accident. He built it deliberately, one morning at a time, by refusing to let the awareness of his own mortality fade into the background noise of daily life. The question is not whether you will have regrets. The question is whether you will build the practice that prevents them before the window for building closes. Chapter 4. Memento Mori and Self-Improvement. Eliminate regret before it forms. The most common misunderstanding about Memento Mori is that it is a passive practice, that it asks you to sit quietly with the awareness of death and find some form of philosophical peace with it. That is part of it, but only the beginning. The Stoics were not interested in contemplation for its own sake. They were interested in action. And Memento Mori, practiced the way Marcus Aurelius practiced it, is one of the most action-oriented tools in the entire Stoic framework. Here is how it works in practice. Every decision you face, large or small, professional or personal, immediate or long-term, can be tested against a single question. If this were the last year of my life, would I make this choice? Not because you should live as though you are dying, but because that question strips away the layers of social expectation, short-term comfort, and distraction that normally cloud human judgment, and reveals what you actually value underneath. Marcus used a version of this test constantly throughout the Meditations. In Book 2, he wrote that a man's life is a mere moment, his existence a flux, his perception clouded, his body's composition corruptible. He was not writing this to depress himself. He was writing it to sharpen himself. Because every time he brought the impermanence of life into focus, the clarity that followed allowed him to act with a precision that most people never access, not because they lack intelligence, but because they have never trained themselves to see past the noise. The practical application for your own life begins with a single daily habit, not a complicated ritual, not an hour of journaling or meditation. Just a moment, ideally in the morning, before the day fills with its demands, where you hold the awareness of your own mortality clearly in your mind and ask yourself one question. What decision have I been postponing that I would regret not making? That question works because regret is not random. It follows a pattern that is almost entirely predictable. People regret inaction far more than action. They regret the conversations they never had, the risks they never took, the direction they never committed to. And almost every one of those regrets traces back to a decision that was postponed, not because the person lacked the courage to make it, but because the urgency of making it was never felt clearly enough to overcome the comfort of waiting. Memento Mori creates that urgency. Not the false urgency of anxiety or panic, but the clean urgency of clarity. The urgency of a person who understands, at a level deeper than intellectual agreement, that the time available to them is real, finite, and already moving. Marcus Aurelius felt that urgency every morning at his writing table. It did not paralyze him. It directed him. And the life he built, under conditions of war, plague, political betrayal, and personal loss that would have broken most people, stands as the most documented proof in human history that the practice works. Chapter 5. Stoic Wisdom for Daily Life. The morning practice that changes everything. The Stoics were not theorists. They were practitioners. And one of the things that separates Stoic philosophy from most other philosophical traditions is the degree to which it concerned itself with the specific, repeatable habits that a person could build into their daily life to produce consistent results over time. Marcus Aurelius did not stumble into the clarity and discipline that defined his reign. He built it through a morning practice that he maintained with the same consistency that a soldier maintains physical training, not because it was always comfortable, but because he understood that the quality of his days determined the quality of his life. The practice began before sunrise. Marcus wrote about this repeatedly in the Meditations. The resistance he felt on cold, mornings when the warmth of the bed made getting up feel unreasonable, and the argument he made to himself each time. You are not born for comfort. You were born to do the work that is yours to do. And that work requires a mind that has been prepared, not one that has been eased gently into the day by the path of least resistance. The preparation Marcus describes in the Meditations has three distinct components that any person can apply today without a throne, without an empire, and without 19 years of Stoic training behind them. The first is the premeditation of adversity. Before the day begins, Marcus would consider what difficulties he was likely to face, not to dread them, but to meet them already prepared. Epictetus, whose teachings Marcus studied closely, described this practice in the Discourses as the foundation of Stoic resilience. A mind that has already imagined the obstacle is not surprised by it. And a mind that is not surprised retains the clarity to respond rather than react. The second component is the review of priorities. Marcus would ask himself, explicitly, what the most important work of the day was, not the most urgent, not the most visible, not the work that would generate the most immediate approval from the people around him, but the work that genuinely mattered in the context of the life he was trying to build. This distinction between important and urgent is one that modern productivity research has confirmed repeatedly. But Marcus was practicing it in the 2nd century, not because a consultant told him to, but because memento mori made the difference between the two impossible to ignore. The third component is the memento mori itself, the direct, unambiguous reminder that the day now beginning is one of a finite number. Not a dramatic confrontation with death, just a clear, honest acknowledgement that the time is real, that it is moving, and that what gets built today either contributes to a life worth having lived or it does not. These three components together take no more than a few minutes, but practiced consistently, over weeks and months and years, they produce something that no amount of talent or intelligence can substitute for, a life built deliberately, from the inside out, by a person who has never lost sight of what actually matters. Chapter 6. Marcus Aurelius Meditations. The passages nobody talks about. Most people who encounter the Meditations for the first time come away with a handful of quotes. The famous ones. The ones that appear on productivity blogs and motivational posters, and the Instagram accounts of people who have never read the book. You have power over your mind, not outside events. The impediment to action advances action. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. These are real passages, and they are genuinely powerful. But they represent a fraction of what Marcus actually wrote. And the passages that tend to get left out are, in many ways, the ones that reveal most clearly how he thought about death, time, and the construction of a life without regret. In Book 4 of the Meditations, Marcus wrote something that most modern readers find uncomfortable precisely because it offers no consolation. He reminded himself that all the people who had ever lived the celebrated and the forgotten, the powerful and the powerless, had vanished into the same silence. The philosophers who debated the nature of reality, the emperors who believed their names would outlast the stars, the soldiers who died on the Danube frontier with no one to record their names, all of them gone. And Marcus, riding alone in his tent by lamplight, included himself in that list without hesitation or self-pity. He would be gone too. The only question was what he would do with the time remaining. This is the passage that separates the Meditations from every other self-help text ever written. Marcus was not promising his reader a better morning routine or a more optimized week. He was confronting the reader and himself with the full weight of human impermanence, and then asking what follows from that confrontation. Not what feels good, not what is comfortable. What follows logically and honestly from the fact that you are going to die and that the life you are building right now is the only one you will get. In Book 10, Marcus returned to the same territory from a different angle. He wrote about the men of Vespasian's time, how they married, raised children, accumulated wealth, fought wars, celebrated victories, and then disappeared entirely, every one of them within a generation. And then the men of Trajan's time did the same. And then the men of Hadrian's time. Each generation convinced, at least partially, that their particular moment in history carried a significance that would outlast them. Each generation absorbed back into the silence that preceded them. What Marcus was doing in these passages was not indulging in nihilism. He was performing a specific cognitive operation that the Stoics called the view from above, the deliberate act of zooming out from the immediate concerns of daily life to see the full arc of human existence, and then returning to the present moment with the clarity that only that perspective can produce. From that height, the things that normally consume human attention, status, approval, the fear of failure, the desire for recognition, shrink to their actual size. And what remains, standing at its actual size, is the life you are choosing to build, one decision at a time, in the time that is actually available to you. These are the passages that make the Meditations a genuinely dangerous book. Dangerous in the best possible sense. Not comfortable, not reassuring, but clarifying in a way that very few texts in human history have managed to be. Marcus was not writing for posterity. He was writing for himself, in the middle of a reign defined by war and plague and loss, trying to stay honest about what mattered and why. The fact that his private notes survived 20 centuries and are still being read by people trying to build better lives is, in its own way, the most powerful argument for the practice he was describing. Chapter 7. Remember you will die, and start living. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, on the Danube frontier, in the middle of a military campaign he had been fighting for most of the previous decade. He was 58 years old. By the standards of Roman emperors, his reign had been remarkably stable, not because the circumstances were easy, but because the man navigating those circumstances had spent 19 years building a mind that could hold difficulty without being destroyed by it. He left behind no monument commissioned in his own honor, no declaration of his own greatness. What he left behind were private notes, never intended for publication, never edited for an audience, that recorded, with complete honesty, the daily struggle of a man trying to live in alignment with what he actually valued. The Meditations are not a record of success. They are a record of practice, of a person returning every single morning to the same foundational question. Given that my time is finite, am I spending it on what actually matters? That question does not belong to emperors. It does not require a Stoic education or a philosophy degree or 19 years of preparation. It requires only the honesty to ask it and the discipline to let the answer change how you live. The regret that Bronnie Ware documented in her palliative care patients, the regret of a life lived for others instead of for what genuinely mattered, does not form overnight. It forms through the accumulation of days spent without that question. Days where the urgent crowded out the important, where comfort won over clarity, where the awareness of mortality stayed safely in the background, where it could not disturb anything. Memento mori is the practice that keeps that awareness where it belongs, not in the background, not as a source of fear, but as the clearest lens available to a human being for seeing what their life is actually made of and what it still has the potential to become. Marcus used it every morning for 19 years. The results are documented in 20 books of private notes that have outlasted every empire, every dynasty, and every political system that existed in his lifetime. You do not need 19 years. You need a question and the honesty to answer it. What decision have you been postponing that you would regret not making? What part of your life have you been building for other people instead of for yourself? What would change tomorrow morning if you held, clearly and honestly, the awareness that your time is finite and already moving? Remember that you will die, and then decide, with that awareness fully present, how you are going to live. If this video gave you a new way of looking at your own time and your own decisions, subscribe to the Stoic Compound. New videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, each one built around the same commitment: ancient wisdom, verified sources, and ideas that are actually worth your time. And if you know someone who has been carrying the weight of regret, or someone who is at a crossroads right now and needs the clarity that this practice can provide, share this video with them. Sometimes the right idea at the right moment changes everything. Remember that you will die, and start living.